Imagine a picture-perfect family, a beautiful suburban home, a loving husband, and a bright-spirited daughter. They seemed to have it all. But behind those closed doors, a devastating secret was waiting to unravel, a secret that would shatter their world forever. What would you do if the people you trusted the most betrayed you in the worst possible way? This is the story of Grace Thompson, a mother who faced the unthinkable and was driven to the edge of madness by heartbreak, deception, and revenge. Stay with me. What you're about to hear will leave you questioning everything. Before we dive into this gripping story, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, you won't want to miss more stories like this. True tales that captivate, shock, and make you question everything you thought you knew about human nature. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What would you do if you found yourself in Grace's shoes? Would you walk away, or would you seek revenge? Grace Thompson's life looked perfect from the outside. A beautiful suburban home, a successful career, a happy family, blended and thriving. Grace had been through heartbreak before. Her first husband passed away unexpectedly when her daughter Sophie was just a little girl. It took years for Grace to find stability again, years to rebuild her life and create a safe, loving environment for Sophie, who had become the center of her world. Then came Andrew. Charming, wealthy, and attentive, Andrew seemed like a dream come true. He swept Grace off her feet, promising her a future filled with love and security. He wasn't just good to her, he treated Sophie like his own daughter. He showered her with attention, bought her thoughtful gifts, and made her feel special. For the first time in a long while, Grace felt she could breathe again. She had a partner to lean on, a father figure for Sophie, a stable, happy life. But perfection is often an illusion. It started with small things easy to dismiss. Andrew would linger a little too long when hugging Sophie. He and Sophie would share hushed conversations, glancing over their shoulders like they had something to hide. Grace brushed it off at first, chalking it up to Andrew being a caring stepfather. After all, wasn't that what she had always wanted? A man who loved Sophie like his own? But Sophie changed too. She became distant. Her once bubbly personality dulled. She avoided her mother, spending more time locked away in her room. Grace figured it was just part of growing up. Sophie was, after all, 19 now, a college freshman. Maybe she needed her space. Or maybe it was something darker. Grace's unease grew. Little things gnawed at her mind. A secretive smile from Andrew when he thought she wasn't looking. Sophie's anxious glances at her phone, the way they both tensed when Grace entered a room. And then came the night that shattered everything. Grace had been on a business trip for a few days. Exhausted from meetings and eager to get home, she decided to cut her trip short by a day. She didn't tell Andrew. She wanted to surprise them. Pulling into the driveway, she noticed the house was dark, unusually quiet. Strange. Andrew and Sophie should be home. She let herself in quietly, dropping her bags at the door. As she climbed the stairs, a faint noise caught her attention, muffled sounds coming from Sophie's bedroom. Her heart skipped a beat. Was Sophie crying? Was she sick? Grace approached the door, which was slightly ajar. The light inside was dim, shadows flickering on the walls. She pushed the door open, intending to check on her daughter. And then, she froze. The sight before her was something she couldn't comprehend. Her mind refused to process it. There, tangled in the bed sheets, was Andrew and Sophie, her husband, her daughter, together. For a long moment, Grace stood paralyzed in the doorway. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The world seemed to tilt, like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. Andrew saw her first. His eyes widened in shock, and he scrambled to cover himself, stammering excuses that she couldn't hear over the roaring in her mind. Sophie turned, her face pale, tears already brimming in her eyes. She didn't speak, didn't move. Grace backed away, her body trembling, her vision blurred by tears. Without a word, she turned and fled the house. The cool night air hit her like a slap, but it did nothing to clear the storm inside her. She climbed into her car and drove aimlessly through the dark streets. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to get away. Away from the betrayal. Away from the horror. Her thoughts spiraled as she drove. How long had this been going on? How could they do this to her? Had she been blind, stupid? She had trusted Andrew, trusted him with her heart, her life, her family. She had allowed him into her home, her most sacred space, only to be betrayed in the most unimaginable way. And Sophie, her daughter, her little girl, how could Sophie do this? The questions swirled, but there were no answers. Only pain. Grace drove until the sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the horizon. She found herself parked by a quiet lake, the water still and peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos inside her. She sat there for hours, staring at the water, lost in her thoughts. By the time she returned home, it was nearly dawn. The house was still and quiet. She stepped inside, her every movement deliberate, as if she was walking through a dream. Andrew and Sophie were asleep, or pretending to be. Grace didn't wake them. She didn't confront them. Not yet. She needed time to think, to process. But one thing was certain. She would not let them get away with this. In the days that followed, Grace went through the motions of daily life as if nothing had happened. She cooked meals, answered work emails, chatted with neighbors. But inside, she was seething, burning with rage and betrayal. She watched Andrew closely, watched Sophie, noted every interaction, every glance, every whisper. Andrew continued his charade as the perfect husband, kissing her goodbye each morning, making plans for their future. He thought he was safe, thought he could maintain his lies. He was wrong. Grace saw through him now, saw the guilt in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. He knew something had changed. He just couldn't figure out what. And Sophie? Sophie was falling apart. She avoided her mother, her guilt evident in every hesitant step, every downcast glance. She couldn't even look Grace in the eye. But Grace wasn't ready to confront them. Not yet. She needed more. So she started gathering evidence. She documented everything, every secret meeting, every text message. She scrolled through Andrew's phone when he wasn't looking, snapping photos of incriminating messages. She followed them discreetly, taking pictures of their rendezvous. But Grace wasn't interested in a simple confrontation. She wanted revenge. She wanted them to feel the same pain she felt, the same betrayal, the same despair. And so her plan began to take shape. It would be methodical, precise, and devastating. Grace's heartbreak had hardened into something colder, something darker. She wasn't just a mother who had been betrayed. She was a woman on a mission. For weeks, she moved like a ghost through her own life, smiling when she had to, nodding when people spoke to her. But inside, her thoughts never wavered. She observed Andrew and Sophie, gathering more evidence, more proof of their betrayal. But the most important thing she gathered was something far more dangerous: control. Andrew and Sophie didn't realize that Grace knew. They had no idea that every time they whispered, every time they exchanged glances, Grace was watching. Andrew believed he was still in control, but Grace was the one pulling the strings now. She started making subtle changes. She suggested that Andrew take a different route to work, asked Sophie to lock the doors at night. Small things that neither of them questioned but planted seeds of doubt. Andrew grew uneasy. Sophie became more withdrawn. The tension in the house was suffocating, like a storm about to break. And Grace waited. She waited until the perfect moment to strike. One afternoon, Grace found Sophie in the kitchen. The girl sat at the table, fidgeting nervously with her phone. Grace sat down across from her, calm and composed. "Sophie," she said softly, "is there something you want to tell me?" Sophie froze. Her fingers tightened around her phone. "No, Mom, why?" Grace leaned forward, her gaze steady. "I know about you and Andrew." The silence was deafening. Sophie's face went pale. Her lips trembled, but no words came out. I saw you, Grace continued. I've seen the texts, the meetings. I know everything. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. She opened her mouth to speak, but all that came out was a choked sob. I don't want to hear your excuses, Grace said coldly. You've made your choices. Now you'll have to live with them. Sophie broke down, tears streaming down her face. Mom, please. I didn't mean for this to happen. He said he loved me. Grace's heart twisted with rage and sorrow. He's a liar, Sophie, and because of him, we're all going to suffer. Grace didn't need Sophie's apology. She didn't want it. What she wanted was retribution. That night, after Sophie went to bed, Grace confronted Andrew. She waited until he was in his study, sitting in his favorite chair with a book in his lap. When he looked up and saw her standing there, something flickered in his eyes. Guilt. Fear. Grace, he said cautiously, is everything okay? Grace didn't answer. Instead, she placed a stack of photos and printed text messages on his desk. Andrew's face went white. He flipped through the photos, his hands trembling. Photos of him and Sophie, meeting in secret. Photos of their text messages, explicit and incriminating. I can explain, Andrew stammered. Grace cut him off, her voice low and steady. Don't you dare! Andrew's shoulders sagged, his head hanging low. I never meant to hurt you. Hurt me. Grace's voice rose. You've destroyed me. You've destroyed this family. For what? For her? Andrew looked up, desperation in his eyes. We can fix this. We can go back to the way things were. Grace laughed bitterly. There's no going back. Not after this. Andrew sat in silence, knowing there was nothing he could say to undo what he'd done. Grace stared at him, her heart pounding with rage. I trusted you. I loved you. And you threw it all away. Andrew reached out, but Grace recoiled, stepping back. I don't want your apologies. I want you to feel what I feel. Andrew's eyes widened in fear. Grace, what are you going to do? Grace didn't answer. Her plan was already in motion. Andrew thought Grace's anger would fade, that she would cry, scream, maybe even leave him, but then eventually move on. He was wrong. The house grew colder, quieter. Grace no longer asked where he was going. She no longer looked at him with love or even hate. Just emptiness. Sophie was unraveling too. She avoided her mother completely. Every moment in the same room with Grace felt suffocating, the guilt heavy on her chest. Grace noticed it all, and she waited, because her plan wasn't about loud confrontations. It was about precision. One evening, Grace made her move. Dinner was quiet. Forced smiles and small talk filled the air. Andrew tried to lighten the mood, suggesting they take a family vacation. That's a great idea, Grace said with a calm smile. We need time to reconnect. Sophie froze. Something about Grace's tone sent a chill down her spine. But Andrew, desperate to fix things, eagerly agreed. A weekend at the cabin, Grace suggested. It'll be just like old times. Andrew nodded, hopeful. Sophie hesitated, glancing nervously at her mother. But Grace's smile was steady. Too steady. The drive to the cabin was tense. Grace sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window. Andrew tried to make small talk, but her answers were clipped and distant. Sophie sat in the back, quiet, lost in her thoughts. The cabin was deep in the woods, isolated and far from the city. A place where no one would hear them. No one would come looking. Grace's heart pounded as they pulled into the driveway. The stage was set. They unpacked in silence. Andrew tried to keep things light, reminiscing about their last trip to the cabin, but Grace only nodded, her mind elsewhere. That evening, they sat by the fireplace. The flames crackled, casting shadows on the walls. Andrew and Sophie exchanged uneasy glances. Something wasn't right. Grace finally stood, brushing her hands on her jeans. I'm going to bed, she said softly. Andrew offered to join her, but she shook her head. I need some time alone. In the middle of the night, Grace moved. She slipped out of bed silently, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment she'd been waiting for. She went to the kitchen, retrieving a bottle of wine. With steady hands, she poured 2 glasses, adding a few drops of a powerful sedative. Taking a deep breath, she carried the glasses into the living room, where Andrew and Sophie were asleep by the dying fire. She gently shook Andrew awake, offering him a glass. "Let's have one last toast," she said, her voice eerily calm. "To new beginnings." Andrew, groggy, smiled weakly and took the glass. Sophie stirred, blinking sleepily as Grace handed her the second glass. "To new beginnings," Grace repeated, her voice steady. They clinked their glasses and drank. Minutes later, the sedative took effect. Andrew's head lulled back, his eyes fluttering shut. Sophie's glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. Grace watched them, her pulse steady. This was it. Her plan had begun. When Andrew and Sophie woke, they were bound. Their wrists and ankles tied tightly with rope. They struggled against their restraints, panic setting in. "What the hell is this?" Andrew shouted, his voice shaky with fear. Grace sat across from them, calm and cold. "You betrayed me," she said simply. "Both of you." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "Mom, please. I'm sorry." Grace's gaze didn't waver. "I don't care." Andrew twisted in his chair, trying to free himself. "Grace, you're not thinking clearly. Let us go." Grace leaned forward, her voice low. "There's nothing to discuss. I've seen everything, the texts, the meetings, the lies. You disgust me." Andrew's face twisted in anger. "This isn't you, Grace. You're better than this." Grace shook her head. "No, this is exactly who I am now." Her voice was steady, but her heart pounded. She felt powerful, in control. But as she picked up the knife from the table, her hands trembled. She had planned this moment in her head 1,000 times. But now, standing on the edge of a dark decision, something inside her cracked. Sophie began to sob, her voice a desperate plea. "Mom, don't!" The sound pierced Grace's resolve. Her hands shook, her heart thundered. The blade gleamed in the dim light, a terrible reflection of her rage and pain. As she took a step towards Sophie, the girl's scream echoed through the cabin. The sound jolted Grace back to reality. Her mind cleared, and suddenly the weight of what she was about to do crushed her. She stumbled back, the knife falling from her hand. Grace backed away, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Her mind spun as the reality of what she had almost done hit her. She had been seconds away from crossing a line she could never uncross. Andrew and Sophie were still bound, panic etched into their faces. "Grace," Andrew whispered, his voice trembling. "Please, let's talk about this." Grace's gaze flickered between them. The people she had loved most in the world, the people who had betrayed her in the worst way imaginable. For a week she had plotted this moment, imagined every detail. But now that she was standing here, on the brink of vengeance, something felt wrong. Her body trembled with the weight of her emotions, anger, heartbreak, despair. She bent down, picked up the knife, and stared at the blade for a long time. Finally, she whispered, "Why?" Andrew swallowed hard, struggling against his restraints. "I never meant for it to happen. It just did." "It just did?" Grace repeated, her voice bitter. "You destroyed me. You destroyed our family. For what? Lust? Control?" Andrew looked down, unable to meet her gaze. Grace turned her attention to Sophie, her daughter, her little girl. Sophie's face was streaked with tears. Her lips quivered as she whispered, "He said he loved me." The words twisted like a knife in Grace's chest. "He lied to you," Grace said through gritted teeth, "and you believed him." "I didn't mean to hurt you," Sophie sobbed. "I didn't know how to stop." Grace's hands tightened around the knife. The rage was still there, burning inside her. But so was the sorrow, the grief, the unbearable weight of betrayal. She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to stay in control. "You had a choice," she said softly. "You both did, and you chose to betray me." Andrew's voice was desperate now. "Grace, please, we can fix this. We can go to therapy. We can—" "There's no fixing this," Grace interrupted. "There's no going back." For a long moment the room was silent, except for Sophie's quiet sobs. Grace took a step back, lowering the knife. Her hands shook violently, and the blade clattered to the floor. "I wanted to hurt you both," she admitted, her voice hollow. "I wanted you to feel the same pain I felt. But what would that make me?" Andrew and Sophie exchanged a glance, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. Grace paced the room, her mind racing. "I was a mother, a wife, someone who believed in love, in trust." She turned to face them, her expression cold. "And you destroyed that person." Andrew spoke cautiously. "You're still that person. We can help you find her again." Grace shook her head. "No, that person is gone." Her gaze hardened. "And I'm not sure what's left." She picked up a pair of scissors and moved toward Andrew. He flinched, bracing himself. But instead of attacking him, Grace cut the ropes, binding his wrists and ankles. Andrew stared at her in disbelief. "Grace!" She turned to Sophie and did the same. When both were free, she took a step back. "I should hate you both," she said quietly, "and part of me does. But I can't keep living like this." Andrew rubbed his wrists, his eyes never leaving Grace. "What now?" he asked cautiously. Grace met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Now, we leave this place." Andrew nodded slowly. "And then?" Grace sighed heavily. "And then, we figure out what comes next." The drive home was silent. Andrew focused on the road. Sophie stared out the window, her face pale. And Grace sat in the back seat, lost in thought. What came next? The plan had been everything. It had consumed her, and now with the plan undone, all she felt was emptiness. They pulled into the driveway, and Grace got out without a word. She walked inside, climbed the stairs, and shut herself in her bedroom. Alone. In the days that followed, Grace barely spoke to Andrew or Sophie. The tension in the house was unbearable. Andrew tried to bridge the gap, but Grace ignored him. Sophie avoided her mother completely. Grace threw herself into work, spending long hours at the office. When she came home, she locked herself in her room. Days turned into weeks. One evening, Grace stood in front of the mirror staring at her reflection. The woman looking back at her was a stranger. Her eyes were hollow, her expression cold. "I don't know who I am anymore," she whispered. She picked up a photo from her bedside table, a picture of her and Sophie, taken years ago. They were smiling, arms wrapped around each other. Tears welled in Grace's eyes. "I just wanted us to be happy." One night, Andrew confronted her. "You can't keep shutting us out," he said, standing in the doorway of her room. Grace didn't look at him. "There's nothing to say." "There's everything to say." Andrew's voice rose with frustration. "We made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but we can't fix anything if you keep pretending we don't exist." Grace turned to him, her eyes filled with anger and pain. "You think this can be fixed? You think we can go back to normal?" Andrew shook his head. "No, but we can move forward." Grace stared at him for a long moment. Then quietly she said, "I want a divorce." Andrew's shoulders slumped. "I figured you'd say that." Grace filed for divorce the next day. She packed her bags and left the house, leaving everything behind. She moved to a small town far away where no one knew her name, rented a modest apartment, found a job at a local office, and began the slow, painful process of rebuilding her life. She wrote to Sophie, letter after letter, trying to explain, trying to make amends. Months passed before Sophie replied. But when she did, it was the beginning of something new, something fragile, a chance at forgiveness. Months had passed since Grace left the house, leaving Andrew and Sophie behind. She had carved out a new life in a small town, quiet, unassuming, and far removed from the chaos of her past. But the ghosts of betrayal still haunted her. Grace thought she could bury her anger, her heartbreak, and move on. But it simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to break through. And then one afternoon, she received an unexpected letter. From Sophie. It was brief, apologetic, a desperate plea to talk. "Mom, I miss you. I'm so sorry for everything. Please, can we meet?" Grace sat at her kitchen table, the letter clutched in her trembling hands. For months she had waited for this, and now that it was here, all the pain, anger, and sorrow came rushing back. But beneath the flood of emotions, something else stirred. An idea. A plan. She picked up the phone and dialed Sophie's number. Her daughter answered on the second ring. "Mom?" Grace's voice was calm. "Let's talk. In person." There was a pause on the other end. "Oh, okay. When?" "This weekend. Just the two of us." The drive to the cabin was eerily familiar. Grace hadn't been back since that night, the night she had nearly destroyed everything. But this time it was different. There was no Andrew, no lies, just her and Sophie. The cabin stood silent, surrounded by dense forest. The air was heavy with memories. Sophie stepped out of her car, hesitating at the sight of the cabin. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she asked quietly. Grace nodded. "It's the perfect place to start over." They unpacked their bags in silence. Sophie wandered through the cabin, her expression distant, lost in thought. Grace watched her carefully. Every movement, every glance. She could see the guilt etched into Sophie's face. But Grace wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. That evening, they sat by the fireplace, the flames crackling softly. Sophie broke the silence first. "Mom, I don't know how to start." Grace stared into the fire, her expression unreadable. "Then don't. Just tell me why." Sophie's voice trembled. "I thought he loved me. He made me feel special. And I was stupid. I should have known better." Grace's gaze didn't waver. "You knew exactly what you were doing." Sophie flinched, tears filling her eyes. "I never wanted to hurt you." Grace's voice was cold. "But you did." Silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken pain. Finally, Sophie whispered, "Can you ever forgive me?" Grace stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I don't know." The tension in the cabin grew heavier with each passing hour. Grace's mind swirled with thoughts of betrayal, revenge, and redemption. She had planned to make them both suffer once. And now, with Sophie sitting across from her, the urge returned. But this time it wasn't anger that drove her. It was control. Grace poured 2 glasses of wine, her movements deliberate. Sophie watched her cautiously. "Mom?" Grace handed her a glass. "To new beginnings," she said softly. Sophie hesitated before clinking her glass against her mother's. "To new beginnings." They drank in silence, the firelight casting shadows on the walls. And as Sophie finished her wine, her eyelids began to droop. Her movements slowed. Her breathing deepened. Grace sat back, watching as her daughter slipped into unconsciousness. Her plan was finally in motion. Sophie's head slumped forward, her glass slipping from her hand and shattering on the floor. Grace sat in silence watching her daughter, feeling the weight of what she had just done. The sedative she had slipped into Sophie's wine was mild enough to keep her unconscious for a few hours, long enough for Grace to do what needed to be done. She stood and moved methodically, retrieving a length of rope from her bag. Her hands didn't shake, her mind was clear. She knelt beside Sophie and tied her wrists and ankles securely, making sure there was no way for her to slip free. Every knot was precise, every movement deliberate. When she was finished, she sat back, staring at her bound daughter. For a long time, Grace said nothing. She simply watched. waiting. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence with a steady rhythm. The minutes dragged on. Finally, Sophie stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, and for a moment she looked confused, disoriented. Then she realized her hands and feet were bound. Panic set in. "Mom!" Her voice was groggy, frightened. "What's going on?" Grace remained seated, calm and composed. "You wanted to talk. Now we will." Sophie struggled against the ropes, her breathing quickening. "Why am I tied up? Mom, what are you doing?" Grace leaned forward, her eyes cold and steady. "I've spent months trying to understand why you did what you did, why you betrayed me, why you destroyed our family." Sophie shook her head frantically. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I was confused." "No," Grace interrupted. "You made a choice. You knew it was wrong, and you did it anyway." Tears streamed down Sophie's face. "I thought he loved me." Grace's expression hardened. "And what about me? Did you ever think about what it would do to me?" Sophie sobbed, her voice barely audible. "I was selfish. I was stupid. I hate myself for what I did." Grace stood slowly, towering over her daughter. "You hate yourself?" She let out a bitter laugh. "You have no idea what hate feels like." Sophie looked up at her, trembling. "What are you going to do?" Grace reached down and picked up the knife she had brought with her. The blade gleamed in the firelight. Sophie's eyes widened in terror. "Mom, please, don't!" Grace turned the knife over in her hands, feeling the weight of it. For weeks she had imagined this moment, what it would feel like to make them both suffer. She had been consumed by her anger, her heartbreak, and now, standing here, holding the knife, she realized something. It wasn't enough. Killing Sophie wouldn't undo the pain. It wouldn't bring back the trust, the love they once had. It wouldn't make her whole again. The knife fell from her hand, clattering to the floor. Sophie sobbed, her body shaking with relief. Grace sank into a chair, her head in her hands. For a long time they sat in silence. The fire crackled softly, the shadows dancing on the walls. Finally, Grace spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to hurt you, both of you. I wanted you to feel the same pain I felt." Sophie lifted her tear-streaked face. "But you didn't." Grace shook her head. "No, I didn't." She looked at her daughter, her expression weary. "Because I realized something. If I hurt you, if I became the monster I've been fighting, I wouldn't be better than him." Sophie's sobs quieted. "Mom, I'm so sorry." Grace nodded slowly. "I know." She stood, moving towards Sophie. With steady hands, she untied the ropes, freeing her daughter. Sophie rubbed her wrists, her gaze wary. "What now?" she asked softly. Grace sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Now, we go home." The drive back from the cabin was heavy with silence. The winding roads stretched endlessly, lined with towering trees that seemed to close in around them. Grace kept her eyes on the road, her grip on the steering wheel firm, knuckles white. Beside her, Sophie sat quietly, staring out the window, lost in her own thoughts. The tension hung between them like a thick fog, unspoken words, unanswered questions, and the lingering shadow of what had almost happened. Grace replayed the scene in her mind, the knife in her hand, Sophie's terrified screams. She had come so close to losing herself, to becoming someone she wouldn't recognize. They were halfway home when Sophie finally broke the silence. "Mom, are you okay?" Grace didn't take her eyes off the road. "No." Sophie bit her lip, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for everything." Grace's jaw tightened. "I know." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sophie asked the question Grace had been dreading. "Do you hate me?" The words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. Grace's hands tightened on the wheel. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I want to. I feel like I should." Sophie's voice trembled. "But you don't?" Grace shook her head, slowly. "No, I'm angry. I'm hurt, but I don't hate you. Tears welled in Sophie's eyes, spilling over as she whispered, I hate myself. Grace glanced at her daughter, her expression softening. Don't say that. But it's true, Sophie said, her voice cracking. I destroyed everything. I hurt you. I hurt us. Grace pulled the car over to the side of the road, turning off the engine. For a long moment they sat in silence, the only sound the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. Grace turned to face Sophie, her eyes filled with sorrow. We've both made mistakes, she said quietly. We've both lost things we can't get back, but hating yourself won't fix it. Sophie wiped at her tears, her voice small. How do we fix it? Grace sighed, the weight of the past months pressing down on her. I don't know, she admitted, but we have to try. When they finally reached home, the house felt different, empty, like a shell of what it used to be. Grace stood in the doorway for a long time, staring into the quiet, dark space. Sophie hovered behind her, unsure of what to do. Are you coming in? She asked softly. Grace nodded, stepping inside, but she felt like a stranger in her own home. Memories flooded her mind, laughter, shared meals, moments of love and trust. All of it felt distant now, like a life that belonged to someone else. Grace walked through the house slowly, her fingers trailing along the walls, the furniture. She paused in front of the family photos on the mantel. Pictures of her, Sophie, and Andrew, smiling, happy. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Look at us, she murmured. We look so perfect. Sophie joined her, her eyes lingering on the photos. We weren't, she said quietly. We just pretended to be. Grace's gaze flicked to her daughter, studying her face. I don't want to pretend anymore, Grace said. I want something real, even if it's messy, even if it's hard. Sophie nodded slowly. Me too. Later that night, Grace sat alone on the porch, watching the stars. The air was cool, the night quiet. Sophie stepped outside, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. Can I sit with you? Grace nodded, and Sophie sat beside her. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their shared pain hanging between them. Finally, Sophie spoke. I never stopped loving you. Grace's eyes filled with tears. I never stopped loving you either. Sophie's voice trembled. I don't know how to fix what's broken, but I want to try. Grace reached out, taking her daughter's hand in hers. We'll figure it out, together. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying their words into the night. And for the first time in a long while, Grace felt a flicker of hope. The days passed slowly, filled with quiet routines and cautious conversations. Grace and Sophie took tentative steps toward healing. It wasn't easy. Every glance, every word carried the weight of what had happened. But they were trying. One afternoon, Grace sat at the kitchen table, flipping through old photo albums. Images of happier times stared back at her. Sophie's childhood, birthday parties, family vacations. A life that felt like it belonged to someone else. She ran her fingers over a photo of her and Sophie, taken years ago at the beach, both of them smiling, carefree. Grace closed the album, her chest tightening. The woman in those photos was gone, replaced by someone harder, colder. But as she sat there lost in thought, she realized something. She didn't want to be that hardened version of herself anymore. Later that evening, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror staring at her reflection. Her eyes were tired, her face drawn. She barely recognized the woman looking back at her. I don't want to be her anymore, she whispered. She splashed water on her face, trying to wash away the heaviness that clung to her. But it wasn't that simple. The next morning, Grace sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise. Sophie joined her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. For a while, they sat in silence, the soft light of dawn casting a gentle glow over the world. Finally, Sophie broke the silence. I've been thinking about what you said, about starting over. Grace nodded, taking a sip of her coffee. We both need it. Sophie hesitated. Do you really think it's possible? After everything we've been through? Grace sighed, her gaze fixed on the horizon. I don't know, but I think we have to try. Sophie's voice was soft. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Grace looked at her daughter, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. Forgiveness isn't about deserving. It's about letting go. Sophie blinked back tears. Do you think you can let go? Grace reached for her daughter's hand, squeezing it gently. I'm trying. Over the following weeks, they began to rebuild their relationship, piece by fragile piece. They cooked meals together, shared stories from their past, and slowly began to trust each other again. It wasn't perfect. There were moments of tension, moments of silence, but there were also moments of laughter, moments of connection. And little by little, Grace began to feel lighter. One day, Sophie brought out a box from her room. These are letters I never sent you, she said, her voice hesitant. Things I wanted to say but didn't know how. Grace took the box, her hands trembling. As she read through the letters, tears streamed down her face. I thought I lost you, she whispered. Sophie sat beside her, resting her head on her mother's shoulder. You didn't lose me. I just lost my way. Grace wiped her tears, her heart swelling with a mixture of sorrow and hope. We've both been lost, she said softly, but we're finding our way back. That evening, Grace stood at the edge of a nearby lake, watching the water ripple gently in the breeze. The lake was calm, peaceful, a reflection of the quiet stillness she was beginning to feel inside. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe, to truly breathe. She closed her eyes, letting the cool air wash over her. And in that moment, she realized something profound. She wasn't defined by her pain. She wasn't defined by her anger. She wasn't even defined by the betrayal. She was defined by her choices, and she was choosing to move forward. Grace opened her eyes, a sense of peace settling over her. The past would always be there. The scars would remain. But she wasn't going to let them control her anymore. She was ready to begin again. Sophie joined her by the lake, their reflections shimmering on the water's surface. What are you thinking about? Sophie asked. Grace smiled softly. I'm thinking about the future. Sophie glanced at her, hope flickering in her eyes. What kind of future? Grace reached out, taking her daughter's hand in hers. A future where we're free, she said. Free from the past, free to heal, free to be happy again. They stood there together, hand in hand, watching the sun dip below the horizon. And for the first time in a long time, Grace felt like she was finally stepping out of the darkness, finally stepping into the light. This story isn't just about betrayal. It's about resilience. It's about how we confront unimaginable pain and decide whether to let it consume us or set us free. Grace Thompson faced a choice to let her anger destroy her or to find a way to heal. Her journey wasn't easy. It wasn't perfect. But she chose life. She chose forgiveness. And that choice saved her. We all face moments of betrayal and heartbreak in life. Moments that can break us if we let them. But just like Grace, we have the power to choose. To choose healing. To choose peace. To choose forgiveness, not for the sake of others, but for ourselves. Because forgiveness isn't about excusing what's been done. It's about freeing ourselves from the weight of what can't be undone. So ask yourself, what would you do if the people you love most betrayed you? Would you seek revenge, or would you choose a different path? Let us know in the comments below. We want to hear your thoughts, your stories, your reflections. And if this story resonated with you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for more real-life stories that captivate, shock, and inspire. Remember, sometimes the greatest act of strength isn't in getting even. It's in learning to let go. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves and the people you love, and we'll see you in the next video.